Hey everybody, this is Petey from the Spinner Rack, and today I am going to talk about, I've been compelled to talk about the so-called feud between Chris Claremont and John Byrne. And, well, obviously we have the artist edition here of John Byrne, we have X-Men Companion, we have some Byrne interviews, Claremont interviews around here. We also have It's not infamous. It's pretty funny. It's if you to escape the basically this is pretty. When I first read this, it was pretty hilarious because he talks about certain things, not necessarily. I think it's been taken to heart too hardly, as far as some of the things in here. There's a later one, Comics Journal, that Byrne talks about stuff which is a little bit harsher. But this one is sort of light fare. Some talking about stuff he likes and dislikes, which kind of turned into, oh no, he's trashing this person, that person, that sort of thing. This one isn't it. The other one has something that a tough thing in it. But we're not going to here to talk about that. We're talking about Chris Claremont and John Byrne. I'm going to call from mostly to memory, but I have some of these things as backup to go to, and yeah. So first of all, in the Comics Journal, because I was listening to Rob's observations again, and he talked about this thing and having the tidbits that were in here that Byrne talks about it. And Byrne also talks about the Claremont interview where Claremont said that Byrne created a mutant that turned the lights on. And Byrne in this thing says, I did not create a character that turned the light on, right? So it's a little back and forth light ribbing. But in this one, Byrne talks about the quality of the product that they put together, and since the fans like it, it's something that's it's a quality product, right? Talks about some of his other collaborations, but in here the key point that it was not mentioned, that John Byrne talks about Chris Claremont describing the relationship with Byrne to be a marriage, right? And when Byrne talks about them not working together, it's basically saying that they had a divorce, and Chris got the kids, and I think John Morrow said, "But you got the house," and Byrne agreed. Well, I got the house, that sort of thing. You got to ask John Morrow about what he exactly meant by that, but Byrne agreed on that. So, um, that would be an idea. But in here, this I guess I should go to the history of it, right? Let's go to the history. That'll be an easy way to start. So in the history of this, John Byrne was starting to get work at Marvel. I think he had one thing published, but he had a couple people trying to get him into Marvel, and one of those people was Chris Claremont. He saw his work, Byrne's work, and wanted to work with him. And Byrne, at the other side, was working for Charlton, and an Iron Fist issue was late by Pat Broderick. I believe Pat Broderick said his cat threw up on the work. The story, that myth has gone many different ways, but I think Pat Broderick settled on that his cat had thrown up on the work, and Chris Claremont called up Byrne and said, um, "Can you do this? But we need this." And I think it was like 10 days or a week. And I think Byrne said, "What do I do for the rest of the days?" And I think he says this on in Sci-Fi Wire, and then from that point he said, "If you do this, then you'll get the regular series of Iron Fist." And after that happens, I think it's Marvel Premiere 25. It's the Iron Fist issue, and then after that they get Iron Fist #1. So there's Iron Fist #1, and then I think Jim Shooter went to Byrne and said, "Hey, if you want to do some more stuff for us," and that got him, what was it, Spider-Man team up with Chris Claremont. So they had a lengthy run on, not really lengthy, sorry. They had a run on both of those titles. Iron Fist got canceled, but that would lead to the X-Men. But before the X-Men, there was a key book, which was Marvel Preview 11 that had a black and white story of Star-Lord that connected Byrne, Claremont, and Terry Austin that Archie Goodwin, the editor-in-chief, had looked at and liked. And when he was trying to figure out a way to save the X-Men, because the X-Men was bi-monthly, meaning 6 times a year, and Archie Goodwin thought if it went monthly, maybe that would save the X-Men, right? So he got Terry Austin to say yes, and then he asked Byrne, and Byrne, of course, wanted the X-Men badly, so he agreed. He did have one stipulation, said maybe the kids will have a problem with the art being so different. Maybe you have Sam Granger, and Archie Goodwin was like, no. But when they first started on the book, Byrne was put in mid-story, which he did a story which was about the Imperial Guard and Lilandra and Lilandra's brother and all this stuff. And I think the next issue, I think Byrne's contribution to that were the two big adversaries in the beginning. But Chris Claremont, Byrne talks about in these things how most of the plot was there. For a 17-page story, there was 15-page plots. It says that routinely in every book here, every book, that it was all there. And obviously contributing Vindicator, who was Byrne's character Guardian, contributing to X-Men 109. But I think early on, I think their first sort of, thing that I think Byrne talked about was that Chris Claremont's still kind of planning on plotting the book with Dave Cockrum and saying, hey, I want to talk some things over with Dave and I'll get back to you. And then Byrne went to the editorial and said, hey, I'm on the book now. So ultimately, at some point, they started plotting together. And I think around 113, X-Men 113, Byrne gets a plot. But in there, which is another thing that Rob didn't point out, is that there was a struggle to get co-plotter credit for Byrne in these books. So, and I think who is it? Dave Cockrum was doing the ads, and so there's some obstacles for Byrne in joining the X-Men. I think can I find the first issue? I had the classic sort of co-plotting sort of credits. Here we go. So you can't see it from here, but in here in this page, you have let's say Chris Claremont has author, both of them as co-plotters, and Byrne as the penciler or artist. Penciler, right? So it tells you, well, I mean, that is my opinion, but Byrne said it was a struggle to get the co-plotting credit. And which is way different from Captain America, where Roger Stern gave Byrne co-plotting credit early on, or whatever, not even so. Yeah, so ultimately, this was something, I guess, possibly a bone of contention between the two of them, right? The next thing was that they would plot stories together, and at times, Chris Claremont would write it differently. So there was a major scene where Cyclops has a beard, and he realizes that it looks a lot like Hussar. And in that scene, it was supposed to be a moment where Cyclops says he envisioned Jean passing in the X-Men 101. And in this moment, she just comes back. She's totally new, this sort of thing. It was supposed to be this moment where he says, he mourned for her. It'd be so hard to just accept this new version of Jean that's basically the same character, but not. So he was struggling with that. And it kind of turned into him saying, hey, I feel nothing for Jean right now. Nothing. And Storm kind of storms off and says something to him. She's not the girl you once knew, and you're not the boy, this, that, the other. And that, I think Stern was in Calgary, and he showed him the original pages, and Byrne is like almost ready to throw the comic pages off of the balcony in Calgary. So with that said, this is me. This is I can't even. It's been so long. There's different places where I've read all this stuff. So ultimately, at this point, I think Roger Stern and Byrne sort of worked out a method to keep sort of things in line. Whereas I think Byrne had said that when he would have an idea, he would present it to Chris as a rough idea. I'm thinking about this, and then he would already talk to Roger Stern about this, and then Claremont would talk to Roger Stern, and he would bring up that idea, and then Roger Stern would say, "Hey, yeah, that's pretty good," and then they would go back and forth doing this. Where one Roger Stern would present an idea that they'd already secretly talked about, and ultimately this would kind of get the book kind of the way Byrne and Roger Stern kind of wanted. And at the same time, Jim Salicrup, he became editor, and he kind of leaned towards Byrne's camp. So while this is also going on, Byrne is kind of learning as he goes along. So there's a article by Stephen Grant, who I think it's not called Old Age. I think it's Permanent Damage or something like that. It was all for CBR. I'm having a hard time finding it. But in that article, he talks about giving them the idea of I think Byrne has pointed that Stephen Grant gave the idea to make Phoenix a bad person so they could do a villain, so they could do whatever they want with her, right? So Stephen Grant was in the office. Obviously, Byrne is not in New York at that time. This Claremont is in the office, and he sees Byrne's Avengers pages, and he says, "How do you get this kind of work out of Byrne?" So now we, fans, look at the X-Men as the pinnacle of Byrne stuff, but at the same time, the writer is looking at the Knights of, was it Wangador? I think it's, yeah, I think that the Quicksilver Scarlet Witch storyline where they, go back to where the High Evolutionary was, that whole storyline where we find out their past and stuff like that, and then Bova and all that. He looked at those pages and he was just like, wow. And he was wishing he could get that kind of work out of John Byrne on the X-Men. And just to end that story, Stephen Grant said, "Well, I kind of give John some sort of plot that is impossible to draw, and he draws it." And he gave it a little more of a perspective on Byrne about the past, the future. But that is the inkling to say that there was some differences between the both of them, right? That's how that going along with the marriage. So it wasn't just because they would have these long conversations. Basically, they would talk over the plot. They would argue and fight because mainly Byrne would say that Chris Claremont hadn't read all of the original X-Men stories, but he had read the Neil Adams stories, and that's what he was kind of drawing from. Byrne was also drawing from that, but he also was a big fan of the first 8 issues. So Byrne had the history of the X-Men in his mind, and at that point probably read all the issues, so he had a little more of a basis, so he could say to Chris Claremont when he said, "Oh, I want to do an origin of Cyclops," and Byrne would point out, "Hey, he already has an origin. I want to do an origin of Xavier." He's like, "Oh no, there's already an origin of Xavier." So there was a slightly different one that Chris Claremont came up with, right? So with all that said, at this point, I think the X-Men are rolling. There's the Belle of the Ball at Marvel. They got the Hellfire Club saga going on. Byrne says, and this is the other thing. At this point, as a plotter, he's doing a lot of heavy lifting as plotting the book. And I think right towards the end of the Dark Phoenix saga, they have switched editors. And where's the book with me? There's a focus on the X-Men, and then focus on the X-Men. Chris Claremont says he doesn't know what happened between him and Byrne, and Byrne says, "I know exactly what happened." He said, at that point, so imagine this. So they would talk over the plots over the phone, and then Chris Claremont would write out the plot, and he would write his own plot, which he would send to the office. So everyone in the office would read these plots, and then at some point, those plots were kind of different from what they'd actually talked about on the phone. So Chris Claremont was going a little differently as he wrote, because I think someone had brought up X-Men 139, 136, and they had that plot that Chris Claremont said, why didn't Byrne kind of draw that? And then we wouldn't have dealt with the whole Dark Phoenix thing. When they talked things over the phone, and Byrne added stuff too. He added the asparagus people. The way they work together, which is the positive to that, is that the asparagus people, Byrne adds that in there, and Chris Claremont doesn't miss a beat. He's saying that, and he writes to that scene, and then he's adding things to the Lilandra stuff. So they're constantly, what they were saying, they were kind of bumping heads and kind of clashing, and it would lead to all this great creative energy. And then I think Chris Claremont said in the what's it the Phoenix the Untold story that Chris Claremont would have a plot and John Byrne would run buses through the plot and then they would plug the holes, and that's kind of how it is. So, but at some point in Dark Phoenix Saga, Louise Simonson got on the book, and Louise kind of leaned on the side of what Chris Claremont was doing. So Byrne kind of felt he didn't have any more power, but at the same time, they were still moving forward. They had a whole list of things to do in the X-Men up to 150. And of course, they have the thing of X-Men 140, where Chris Claremont, where Colossus pulls out the stump, and then Chris Claremont writes like that he's struggling, and Byrne has it, and he's talked about it in this. So the arc moment, it wasn't a new thing. He's like saying, that he had an arc moment, and at the same time, him saying he had an arc moment, Perez, who read this, also said he had arc moments working with Marv Wolfman. So it's not that strange a thing, right? So got through that. Byrne, it decides is that he's going to leave the X-Men. He's got a lot of notoriety at this point. He's got the Fantastic Four lined up to write. He was doing Captain America, but they ran into him and Stern kind of ran into something with Jim Shooter that, only, I think they said, well, basically they weren't on that. So, but Byrne was planning on doing the Fantastic Four and just writing it. So, but he decides he wants off. He turns to Terry Austin and says, hey, you want to do the Fantastic Four with me? And Terry at that point was kind of like, oh, I thought Byrne was going to be on this forever. And that's why he loosely decides he can kind of, move on to the next thing. So they separate. I think they asked Terry to stay. Terry decides not to stay. They, Cockrum had already said he wanted the book back if Byrne ever left. Cockrum goes on there and the book blows up even more. So we're going to get into that part about the X-Men blowing up even more, because Byrne talks about that too, right? So we're still talking about the so-called feud, right? So they have what we already said was a divorce. They separate. One is doing Fantastic Four, and the other's doing the X-Men. And then at this point is a very productive period. So they're cordial, they're friendly in the office. I think Byrne's probably some point, I think he's a Captain America. He moved to Brooklyn, so I think he's in New York. He was in Chicago at some point. Then he's in Brooklyn, I think, while he's doing Captain America. So he's in New York City. So he's around the office from time to time. Oh, the other big issue is that when they would go to the cons, and this would lead to sort of the behind the scenes issues of talking about Byrne and saying, I guess I don't have any sort of nailed down proof, but it came out when Patty Cockrum, the whole Cockrum tribute book, when that whole thing blew up, kind of hinted that there was some things going on behind the scenes between this relationship with Byrne and Claremont, and saying that there was these issues that were going on behind the scenes. But it's hard to say because I wasn't there. I don't know what happened. I don't know exactly what happened. So I'm stating that first. But ultimately, when they would go to the con, there were elements in this X-Men that were Chris Claremont ideas and Byrne ideas. And Byrne will point out that the Wolverine trying to touch the deer, that was a Chris Claremont idea. What's the name of who's that guy? The arcade was a Chris Claremont idea. Some of the ideas Byrne wanted to push Phoenix out. Somehow the X-Men are dead, Phoenix and Xavier are not in the book for a while. And Byrne said that's kind of an error. Those books were missing something without Xavier. And he realized the importance of the character. But those are the things he was kind of pushing for. So you see there's different elements that came from the different person. Where you have Wolverine alone, most of Wolverine hacking away at everyone is Byrne's, right? The moment where Wolverine has his Clint Eastwood moment, that's Chris Claremont wanting to have that Clint Eastwood moment. And he said, I think there were scenes that Chris wanted that didn't have a lot of dialogue. I think that's what Byrne. I can't. I need to have all these things right in front of me. But so that sort of says when they were at cons and Byrne, they would say, "Hey, Chris, I love that thing you did here," and Byrne would say, "Oh no, that was mine," and that led to some bad feelings between the two of them, right? And that would lead to, I think, the hint of talking about Byrne's ego, that sort of stuff, right? So we said it. I got that out. Ultimately, they separate. X-Men becomes a big success. The Fantastic Four jumps up in numbers, not as big as the X-Men, but it's doing well. So ultimately, the first thing that they run into is Chris Claremont does a Doctor Doom story, as a lot of people did at that time. There's one in Iron Man. There's one in Dazzler at the same time. Obviously, the Fantastic Four had their anniversary, so they have a Doom story. And then I think a little while after that, there's a Micronauts one. So there's a lot of Doom running around Marvel at the same time when Byrne starts the book. And I think after that Doom story, the FF office said, no more Doom for the X office. It has to be totally approved by us, right? So while this is going on, there's a, Galactus comes back, and Jim Shooter wants Galactus to be restored to his greatness. So they do a story where Fantastic Four have to save Galactus. The Avengers and Fantastic Four have to save Galactus, and Galactus gets sent off and vows never to devour Earth again, right? But because the Galactus was near death, and he was revived, and then goes off without having any punishment. That brought Chris Claremont back to the Phoenix here, where he's like, wait a second. Jim Shooter said the Phoenix had to pay for what she did, for the death of this planet. And now Galactus, who's eaten many planets and he's almost dead, and he's allowed to live and move on and eat more planets. This didn't work for Chris Claremont at all. Like, this was like he was totally, and this is another behind the scenes thing I think that Byrne had brought up, that Chris was like bringing up, had issue with this. So ultimately, in the year's time, nothing happened with that. But in the X-Men, something did. In the X-Men, Landra, a year later, in X-Men 167, decides to complain about Reed Richards and puts a decree that if Galactus eats another planet, it'll be on Reed Richards' head. Not the Avengers, anyone who, because they aided and abetted saving Galactus. Thor specifically used his own energy to save Galactus. Captain America said yes. Thor agreed and Reed agreed. All the rest of the teams, they were like, I'm not with it, but it makes sense, right? So she makes this decree, and Byrne is like, what the hell is this? Like, they're X-Men, the Fantastic Four, knee deep in the negative zone, and he just heard that the Landra made a decree that Reed will pay if Galactus eats another planet. So Byrne goes to Shooter to deal with it, and Shooter says, write a story about it. So the whole arc from Fantastic Four 257 to 262 is Byrne's reaction to this thing, to deal with what if Galactus eats another planet. So Byrne hadn't planned on Galactus eating another planet, or even the Galactus story. So the next story he does, once Fantastic Four back on Earth, is that Galactus eats the Skrull homeworld. So this leads to, I think, in the same issue. Is it the same issue? In the same issue at the end, or maybe the next one, in the same issue, you have Reed Richards. The next you know, he's gone, right? Totally gone. So then in the next issue, we have Byrne strike back to Chris Claremont, where he does a scene where he mentions the arcade story, that it was a robot there, and he says, "How did you get that scratch on you?" Because Arcade lit a match on him, and he says he might be useful to him. And said, "Doom needs no one," right? So this, once fans figured out that Doom was a robot, felt like the whole story was killed because it wasn't the real Doom, right? Whereas I think a lot of key stories were done by Doom robots. Even the first story had a Doom robot running around, right? So with that said, that was all. I think that is there any more beefs after that? I don't know if there's any more. There's only that Byrne. They asked Byrne to do, I think, X-Men Titans, which he said no to. He did say yes to um, X-Men Alpha Flight, but he said let someone else plot it. So you see the plot is by someone else. But it had Byrne had also asked for Kitty not to be in there. Kitty was all over the plot, so Byrne was kind of like no. And then but people say, oh, like I think there's a hint of saying people were upset with him and he was nasty and all this stuff. But they always bring up, oh, and Paul Swift came and saved the day. Well, he didn't actually do that. He came. They called up Paul Smith as the next option, and he somewhere and said no. How dare you? Hung up. Then he picked up the. Then he looked at a bike he wanted and picked up the phone and called up them and asked to do it. And then that's how we got Paul Smith on. You can read that in Wizard Magazine. He said it in Wizard Magazine. So ultimately, in this part, they are both people that work at Marvel. They're cordial. I don't think they talk on the phone. The last bit that they had issue with, I think, was when Chris Claremont was doing the New Mutants. That was sort of a rejected idea that Byrne and Claremont came together. It wasn't called the New Mutants. They were just going to have a second set of students in the X-Mansion that Xavier and the adult team would train. Right? That was the idea, and that was rejected by Shooter. And then at some point, when I think Chris Claremont and Louise Simonson came up, hey, we got this idea for New Mutants, and he said yes. And then he was like, Chris Claremont was afraid that Byrne's gonna, ask for a portion of it. And then since the Alpha Flight was mostly Byrne's fan characters, Byrne said, well, as long as Chris doesn't own the Alpha Flight, I'm fine. So they moved on, but the problem is, in the end, I think since Chris Claremont wrote the dialogue for those those characters, same way like Byrne wrote the dialogue for Omega Red, they get credited for creation, when not the story was collaborative between Byrne and Claremont, but the creation of those characters of all of the Alpha Flight was done by Byrne, by himself. So, and there's also, what else? Post Byrne didn't really like the way the X-Men were going, but he also said, hey, if it ain't broke, don't it ain't broke, don't fix it. Like, as long as he's as long as there's with success. And that's the different approach with Byrne, kind of looking at the X-Men as the illusion of change. Chris Claremont, and in my opinion, was trying to jazz himself up with characters to evolve, to change, to have a new sort of conflict to deal with. And you see the characters change as they go along, sometimes very abruptly, right? So I think the only thing else that happens is post this point is that oh yeah, there's a couple things. So they are, cordial. I think Chris Claremont had a character called Psycho for the New Mutants, which was going to be Xavier's son. It was a rejected idea. The Byrne kind of rejected that Proteus was Xavier's illegitimate son, and then he did it later with David Haller, who was Xavier's illegitimate son later. But at the same time, Byrne said, "Don't call him Psycho, call him Legion." And I'll give you the tag. The tagline is, "I am Legion, and we are many." And he used that in the comic book, right? But ultimately, that's what they did at that time, passing off ideas and things for each other, right? So moving on, I think Chris Claremont came up with the name Alpha Flight, and Byrne. So I guess that's ultimately another thing which would give Claremont something, but at the same time, as collaborators, since they both kind of agreed that it wasn't, you know, moving on. The biggest thing was that at some point, I think now Shooter says that Claremont was trying to bring back Jean a couple times, which he rejected. Same with Dave Cockrum. Ultimately, when X Factor was happening, and Jim Shooter said it would be better if we could bring Jean in here. They didn't want Dazzler. He was like saying that the big thing was having these original guys come back would be to have Jean back, right? So Byrne said, "I have a way to do it." So he came with a way to do it. And then in the end, after he did it, I think Byrne had done, and that Superman was announced, and for some reason it got, his initial story was supposedly rejected, and they asked Byrne to redo it. And Byrne was said, I think Byrne said to them, "I don't have the time. If you tell me what's wrong with it, then I can probably try to help, but I don't have any time in my schedule to redo that issue." So I think some people say that Shooter was going to fire him, but Byrne is in print saying he told him that he didn't have time to redo it. So they got Jackson Geist, and they got Chris Claremont to rescript it, which really changed the whole point of that story that Byrne did, which caused Byrne to take his name off of it. Right? So with that said, and then Byrne leaves, and leaves not because of that, because of Shooter, and he moves on, realizing he can't do Marvel and DC while Shooter's there, right? So then I don't think there's anything that happens between them after that. I think, as Byrne said in there's a Wonder Woman interview where he said they're cordial and friendly. So I think when Byrne got back to Marvel, Byrne was doing the She-Hulk. Chris Claremont wrote a I guess a fan letter in there, and there's something else. I'm gonna grab something. I'll be right back. Here we go. So while Byrne's doing that, what else? She-Hulk. Claremont's doing Excalibur. And Excalibur is a human book, so he does some adds Byrne in there a couple times. And they even have a scene where Byrne and Claremont Byrne has the Avengers, and She-Hulk behind his back, where Chris Claremont has the Hellfire women around him. So there's a couple of things where there's a couple of gags, I think, in She-Hulk. She-Hulk says Chris Claremont's not going to be happy about this, that sort of thing. So I don't think there's any sort of beef at that point. I think it's well far gone after that point. And then we'll use these guys. Hey, in Whipping Boy here, it says, "Praise for Whipping Boy, a powerful and thought-provoking exploration of the nature of morality and what happens when the ties that binds us are cut. This is a book that will stay with the readers long after they finished it." Chris Claremont, author of First Flight and Grounded. So he wrote some praise for that. So ultimately, they got past it. well, believably so. They were going to work together again. And now, one of the things that made the Byrne not really working with him after that, he didn't really work with many writers after he left the X Men. After he left the X Men, he couldn't. I don't think they figured. They did a couple of stories for Roger Stern. Did a lot of covers for other people. He worked with Louise Simonson on the Heroes for Hope, but that's only like 4 or 5 pages. And then there's no real the Hulk he wrote himself. He goes to DC. I think the only other writer he worked with outside of working with artists is Paul Kupperberg for a Doom Patrol story. He wrote for other people. So at this point, he was a artist who draw, a writer who draws. He did write a lot of things. When he comes back to Marvel, he works with Archie Goodwin, which is someone he wanted to work with. So and he works on Wolverine, so they work together on that. He works. Does he do any? He does a New Mutants with what was it? Does the New Mutants with Louise Simonson, and then Jim Lee asked him to do a jam issue for the X Men, and that's the first time that they worked together post the X Men, I believe. And then post that, there's not a lot of writers that Byrne worked with after that. He's still writing most of his own stuff. I think probably some other person, but I know there's obviously in What the he worked with Scott Lobdell for a story there. So yeah, there's I think there's something that I think Chris Claremont says something about Babe, where it says that you know, you know, he talks about Byrne's current work and being critical of it. That's not really something that is beef wise because he's talking to Jim Lee about it. So it's just something critical, and at the same time, you know, we got Byrne being critical in this thing. We got so many things of Howard Chaykin being critical. At times artists are critical of each other and what they dislike and what they like. It's just a part of the business, right? So I think that's it. I think I've covered a lot of stuff about this. If since it's been so many from Byrne's website, a couple of Chris Claremont things, because Chris Claremont in this book talks about how working with a strong storyteller, when even if you disagree with some of the stuff that their choices, you're hurting yourself by not allowing these guys to kind of explore themselves and and try different things as an artist. So it was a good run. You have Iron Fist, 2 seconds on Power Man and Iron Fist. You have Marvel Team Up. You have X Men, and then you have the classic Star Lord story, which Star Lord is big now. And post that, we don't have much of anything outside of the JLA thing where Byrne plotted and Chris Claremont scripted. They were supposed to do the end, which Byrne agreed to, but that fell apart because of Quesada and Gemis. So I think that's it. I think I've covered it of all of the back and forth that was there. But at the same time, what am I supposed to say here? I don't have anything else to say about this besides that there were some little things, but at different points after that, they were in the same room. And over time, these comments that we read now snowball into a big thing because we're like, oh, look at the shot that this guy said. Oh, look at the shot that guy did. Whereas there's the whole period in the, I think when Shooter was gone, there was a loose talk, someone saying that Byrne might become editor-in-chief, which probably Byrne said if someone ever offered me that, I would turn it down. It'd be like the wrong thing for me to do. He said, but if I was, and that Chris was real worried that I would become that, and I would come attack the X-Men. And Byrne said in there, the last book I would attack would be the X-Men because it's so successful. He said, but once it starts slipping, Chris, watch out. So there's a lot of gags and a lot of stuff that Byrne says. So, and I think that's what's kind of missed. I think Shooter saw George Carlin and said, "Who's this guy doing Byrne?" So yeah, there's some chops. And there's also praise. There's praise of Byrne saying in this book here, saying, so I can go on for days on stuff I like about Chris's work. It says, and Peter says, what? He said, well, he has the ability to, you know, make you care about a character over a couple panels. And then he said, what, in the issue where Kitty's Nightmare? He said, no, that one I gave him a lot of pages to play with. I'm thinking of Proteus, where we had the girl, Jenny Banks, where she's introduced on one panel and dies a couple panel after that. But you care about her. There's also the cop. There's some things of this sort of being able to give so much character in such a small amount of time. So, and he also says that he was inspired by his dialogue was kind of inspired by it for a while, but he was more inspired by Ling Wen, but he kind of broke out of the what he felt he was doing criticisms. So that's it. I think I got it all in. Spin Rack out.